Before a system fractures, it doesn't always announce itself with sirens. Sometimes it shows up in masks, unmarked vehicles, and a street corner that suddenly feels like a war zone. That's what Minneapolis and St. Paul have been staring at for the last couple months. And here's why this matters. Minnesota isn't supposed to be the place where federal immigration enforcement becomes a national flashpoint. When it happens there, it's a signal flare that the national tension has moved from policy debates to physical contact. Let's anchor this in what we actually know. In December, the Trump administration deployed nearly 3,000 federal immigration agents to Minneapolis-St. Paul in an operation Reuters reports was dubbed Operation Metro Surge. Then, in January, 2 confrontations tied to protests around immigration enforcement ended in fatal shootings. Renee Good was killed on January 7th, and Alex Preddy was killed on January 24th. Those are the hard pegs in the ground. Now, let's talk about what everyone feels, because feelings are not facts, but they drive the entire public reaction. A chunk of the country hears ICE surge and thinks, finally, go get the criminals, restore order. Another chunk hears it and thinks, this is intimidation, this is federal occupation, this is how rights get trampled. And the reason this is exploding is because both sides can point to something very real. If you're pro-enforcement, you're looking at a country that's been strained for years. Border chaos, fentanyl trafficking, identity fraud, violent offenders who shouldn't be here, sanctuary politics that turn local cops into paper pushers while federal agencies are told to figure it out. You're not crazy for wanting the laws enforced. A nation that can't enforce its own borders is like a homeowner who argues about paint color while the front door is hanging off the hinges. If you're worried about civil liberties, you're looking at masked agents, aggressive crowd contact, confusion over who's who, and deaths in the street. You're not crazy for asking, what rules are governing these operations? What oversight exists? What training standard is being applied? And are Americans being swept into this chaos? Reuters reported a poll showing 39% approval of Trump's handling of immigration. And that while most Republicans supported mass deportations, a meaningful minority expressed discomfort with tactics they viewed as going too far. That's not a left-wing opinion. That is reality. Even supporters can support the mission and still demand professionalism. Here's my point. A republic can survive hard enforcement. A republic can survive protests. A republic cannot survive a loss of legitimacy, because once legitimacy breaks, people stop cooperating. And when cooperation dies, force becomes the default language. So the real question isn't, should immigration law be enforced? The real question is, can we enforce it with discipline, clarity, and constitutional restraint without turning American streets into a propaganda factory for both extremes? Because that's what happens when the operational footprint becomes messy. Activists get martyr narratives. The federal machine gets painted as lawless. Every interaction becomes content. Every clip becomes proof of someone's worldview. And the actual public, normal families, get stuck living inside the pressure cooker. Now, about those 2 deaths, because we're not going to do the cheap thing and pretend they're simple. What we know has been reported about Renee Good. Remember, January 7th. Reporting indicates a confrontation occurred connected to immigration enforcement activity, and video footage has been cited as showing a federal agent being struck by a vehicle during the chaos. That matters because there's a basic principle in the real world that doesn't require ideology. When you drive a 2-ton vehicle into a human being, you've escalated the encounter into lethal force territory. Not because anyone deserves to die. That's not what I'm saying. But because physics doesn't care about politics. At the same time, constitutional reality check, being wrong, panicked, or emotionally charged does not mean you forfeit all rights, nor does it automatically make every use of force clean. That's why investigations exist. That's why evidence matters. That's why we don't outsource truth to whichever side edits better. What we know has been reported about Alex Preddy. Remember, January 24th. Reuters reports Preddy was killed during a confrontation with immigration agents at protests, and the operation became a national uproar partly because of the optics and escalation. And that matters because protests, whether you like them or not, are where legitimacy gets tested. The government doesn't get graded on how it behaves when everything is calm. It gets graded on whether it can keep order without becoming the thing it claims to oppose. Now, I'm going to say this in plain English, no political poetry. If you step into the middle of a federal operation while armed, ignoring lawful commands, you are gambling with your life. That's not victim blaming. That's not excusing death. That is adult reality. Bad decisions don't justify death, but bad decisions absolutely explain why death shows up. And here's the other half that people hate hearing. If federal agents run sloppy operations, escalate unnecessarily, or can't articulate why force was needed, they don't just create tragedy. They create a recruiting poster for national unrest. This is why Minneapolis matters. Not because it's Minnesota, because it's a blueprint of what happens when the federal government tries to do a hard job inside a politically hostile environment, while every bystander has a camera, every activist has a narrative, and every mistake becomes national fuel. Before we go any further, we have to lock in the reality that two things can be true at the same time. Number one, a nation has the right to enforce its immigration laws. Number two, a nation also has the obligation to enforce them cleanly, transparently, and constitutionally. That's not both sidesing for comfort. That's the actual American standard. And Minneapolis, over the last couple months, has become a stress test for that standard. Because what's happening there isn't just ICE doing ICE things. It's bigger. It's the collision of federal power, street-level tactics, public trust, and a protest culture that, depending on the day, ranges from legitimate civic pushback to straight-up agitation. And once that collision happens, the information war starts immediately. According to Reuters reporting, the Trump administration deployed a 3,000-strong force of federal agents in Minneapolis as part of the operation, and later acknowledged the operation needed to be smarter, including guidance telling officers to avoid unnecessary engagement with agitators and shift away from broad street sweeps toward more targeted actions. That matters because it tells you something important. When you go broad, you don't just increase enforcement, you increase friction. And friction is where mistakes happen, misunderstandings happen, and where opportunists show up to turn the whole city into content. This is the part people hate hearing, but it's true. Crowds don't create clarity. Crowds create confusion. And confusion is where bad decisions breed. Reuters describes Minneapolis being gripped by protests after Renee Good, 37 years old, was shot dead behind the wheel of her car by an ICE agent on January 7th, followed by the death of Alex Preddy, 37 years old, an ICU nurse shot by federal agents on a Saturday morning later in the month. Now here's where I'm going to be extremely direct, because this is where narratives try to hijack your brain. Officials defended the agents immediately and labeled both people as domestic terrorists, while multiple videos reviewed, verified by Reuters, raised questions about whether either person intended to harm anyone. That's not me leaning anything. That's the core issue. When the government speaks in absolutes and video evidence complicates the story, the public stops trusting the microphone. And the second the public stops trusting the microphone, you don't get unity, you get factions. Reuters reports newly unearthed. Reuters verified videos showing Preddy had a physical confrontation with federal agents 11 days before he was shot, yelling, spitting, kicking a vehicle, shattering a taillight, while agents used gas in the area. The agents eventually let him walk away, and what appeared to be a gun was visible tucked into his waistband. Then, in the fatal encounter, Reuters describes videos showing an agent pulling a gun from Preddy's waistband after he's restrained on the ground, seconds before another officer fires the first shot into Preddy's back, with Preddy then unarmed. Reuters also reports Preddy had a legal license to carry a concealed weapon. Read that again, slowly. prior confrontation with agents, high emotion, crowd environment, weapon present, rapid escalation, and then video that throws gasoline on everything. This is exactly why I keep saying common sense is undefeated. If you insert yourself into a federal enforcement action, especially a tense one, while armed, while emotions are spiking, while everyone's yelling, while visibility is trash, you're not helping. You're walking into a blender and then acting surprised when it turns on. That doesn't mean the shooting is automatically justified. That's not what I'm saying. It means the conditions were primed for disaster. And if you're a grown man, you don't cosplay innocence after you choose to step into a volatility zone. Here's my line in the sand. I am pro law enforcement. I am pro border enforcement. I am pro rule of law. But I'm also pro body camera, pro clear identification, pro clean articulation, and pro real timelines. Because if enforcement is righteous, it can withstand sunlight. And if enforcement can't withstand the sunlight, you don't have enforcement. You have a PR operation. One of the most corrosive details in Reuters reporting is that agents in the crackdown often wore masks and sometimes lacked clear identification. And the government has not named the agents involved in the shootings. Let me translate that into regular human language. If you want the public to trust force, you don't make it anonymous. Anonymity is how rumors grow legs. Now, yes, there are safety concerns for agents and their families. I get that. But the answer is policy-level protection, not a system where force becomes a faceless rumor. Reuters reports border czar Tom Homan said the operation would become more focused, and internal guidance told officers not to unnecessarily engage agitators while directing a shift toward targeting immigrants with criminal records rather than random street stops. That's not nothing. That's the government saying we can't keep doing this the same way in a city this lit up. And here's the Watchman takeaway. When tactics change, it's because reality pushed back. This is where Minneapolis becomes bigger than Minneapolis. Because the deeper issue isn't ICE versus protesters. The deeper issue is, do we still have a shared standard for truth and accountability? If a person makes reckless choices around a federal operation, common sense says bad outcomes becomes more likely. If agents fire rounds that look indefensible on video, common sense says you better have airtight articulation, policy compliance, and transparent review. If politicians and media pick whichever version helps their tribe, common sense says the public gets radicalized either way. That is the cycle, and Minneapolis is showing it in real time. Here's what I want you to zoom in on, because this is where most people get played. When a high-profile federal shooting happens, two things can be true at the same time. Number one, law enforcement can be dealing with a real threat, moving fast in a chaotic moment. Number two, the public still has the right to demand accurate facts, clean timelines, and accountability statements, especially when the person killed is an American citizen. That's not anti-cop. That is pro-republic. That's constitutional. That's called adult behavior. Because if we're going to be a country that expects citizens to follow the law, we also need to be a country that expects institutions to speak the truth when the spotlight hits. And right now, the reason Minneapolis is such a pressure cooker is because people don't just feel tension. They feel mistrust. What we actually know, and why I think it matters. Multiple outlets have reported that federal officials defended the shooting of Alex Preddy in Minneapolis, even as video evidence raised questions about how the story was being framed publicly. AP reported President Trump said he wants an honest investigation, and DHS told Congress that 2 federal officers fired shots during the encounter that killed Preddy. CBS reported newly released video showing Preddy in a scuffle with federal officers 11 days earlier, which matters because it adds context to how escalations can build, how familiarity can form, and how quickly this guy again can turn into a bad decision tree on both sides. Now, listen closely. I'm not here to pretend every federal operation is clean. I'm also not here to pretend every person who ends up in the middle of one is an innocent angel just checking on a friend. Both sides do propaganda. One side does it with press releases. The other side does it with cut clips, captions, and outrage farming. And if you're a grown man watching this, you should be allergic to all of it. The common sense line nobody wants to say out loud: if you insert yourself into a high-risk situation, especially armed, especially into something that's already a federal law enforcement operation, you are gambling with your life. That doesn't make a death good. It doesn't mean the government gets a free pass. It doesn't mean officers should be sloppy. But it does mean we need to stop acting like actions don't have consequences in this country. Because here's the part that's missing from modern America. Choices have weight, not vibes, not hashtags, not your intentions or your version. Weight. If you're stepping into a volatile scene, you don't get to be shocked when volatility finds you. And on the other hand, if you're wearing the badge or the federal patch, your words matter after the smoke clears. Your timeline matters. Your description matters. Because the second you get caught stretching the narrative, you don't just lose trust from the other side. You lose trust from everybody who still has a spine and a brain. Why this explodes in Minneapolis specifically? Because Minneapolis is already a symbol. It's a city where people don't just debate policy, they debate reality. They debate whether law enforcement is legitimate. They debate whether laws should be enforced evenly. They debate whether force is ever justified. They debate whether criminals are misunderstood or just criminals. And when you drop a federal shooting into that environment, you get a perfect storm. Federal agencies trying to maintain authority and operational legitimacy. Local politics primed to resist federal presence. Activist networks ready to mobilize fast. Social media accounts eager to profit off chaos. And citizens stuck in the middle trying to figure out what is true. This is not left versus right. That's order versus disinformation. So, my Watchman takeaway. If you want stability, you need clarity. If you want to support law enforcement the right way, you don't do it by repeating talking points you haven't verified. You support them by demanding clean investigations, accurate statements, transparent evidence releases, accountability where it belongs, and basic honesty. Because when law enforcement is right, truth helps them. And when law enforcement is wrong, truth is the only thing that fixes it before the next incident turns into an even bigger disaster. Here's the hard reality. A country that can't tell the truth cannot stay free. Not long term. And this is where I'll make it personal without selling you anything. I've been writing my thriller, Dead Reckoning, in the background of all of this. Because fiction is one of the only places left where people can still look at power, pressure, and human decision-making without immediately turning it into a team sport. Not because fiction replaces facts, but because it trains your instincts, how fast things break, how quickly narratives form, how one dumb choice can trigger a chain you cannot walk back. In Minneapolis right now, it's not a movie. But it's the same kind of chain reaction. One city, one incident, competing stories, national consequences. If you want a country that survives the next decade, stop outsourcing your brain. Hit like if you're tired of propaganda from both sides. Subscribe because I'm going to keep doing what most people won't. Break it down with facts, context, and backbone. And comment this down below so I know I have real adults in here. Verify first. Because sentinels don't react late, they stand early. Stay sharp, stay disciplined, and as always, continue to stand watch.